Thanks so much, Mark, for that really kind introduction. It's such an honor to be part of this series, and it's really a pleasure to get to just talk about the books I love and the books I hope you love as well, and to talk about both books and the living world with people who love both. I think a lot of the books I'm going to talk about are disturbing in some ways, or talk about disturbing problems. But I think even books that talk about the most disturbing problems, climate change, extinction, can give us solace by putting a name to our worries, assure us that we're not alone in our concern. They can suggest solutions, they can provide us with purpose. And I think most importantly, they can also offer connection. So many people who love the outdoors also love reading. The experiences aren't separate for me. One enriches the other. Connections with other forms of life on the page and off are not in conflict, but in conversation. And so I think all of this leads to a shift in thinking. I think books can shift our thinking as few other experiences can, just as experiences in the outdoors, experiences in the natural world can shift our thinking as few other experiences can. So I'm going to go through about 20 books, but there are more than 20 books in several different categories. Only a couple of them are particular to Central Oregon, but I think all are relevant to this place and the issues you face. And I hope it'll inspire you to seek out these titles from your favorite independent bookstore, but also seek out other authors and titles new to you. So the first one really needs no introduction from me, but I want to mention it anyway. Who hasn't read Braiding Sweetgrass? Anyone? Okay, well, look, there's one person. Not to shout you out, but I think it might be for sale behind you. Someone who writes about conservation, I am just so grateful to Robin Wall Kimmerer for introducing the word reciprocity into the conservation vocabulary. It just seemed like this is a concept that we needed and we were feeling our way toward, and we just weren't coming up with the right word for. It has shifted the national and even global conversation about how humans relate to the rest of the living world. And I'm really grateful for her integration of Western science and other forms of knowledge and expertise. She demonstrates, I think, in the book itself that these ways of knowing can be intertwined, can be complementary, and should be in dialogue. And she also, I think, opened the doors of the publishing establishment to Indigenous voices. This was long overdue, but these authors are now introducing non-Indigenous and Indigenous readers to the human history of the landscapes we live with, other ways of seeing land, other ways of seeing plants and animals. And I think that helps us see past the assumptions that we were raised with, and that's hugely exciting. A couple other books in this category I'll just mention quickly. As Long as Grass Grows by Dina Gilio-Whitaker, which traces the fight for environmental justice in North America, going back to colonization up to the present day, making it clear that the institutional conservation movement or institutional environmental movement has only recently started to make the case that caring for the environment also means caring for people, and that is nothing new. Likewise, Fresh Banana Leaves looks at Indigenous science throughout the Americas, also a very powerful case that these ways of thinking have been around much longer than any of us alive today. There are so many books about wolves that I could recommend. I just finally decided to go back to the classic, because we shouldn't forget the classics. Of Wolves and Men was published in 1978. And it really was my first encounter with this idea that we imagine the wolf. We imagine the wolf in many different ways over many different generations, and those imaginings change. I think it's really instructive to go back to Barry Lopez now and see how relevant what he said about wolves is still today, and what has changed. Also in the wildlife category, Migrations by Charlotte McConaughey. As someone who writes a lot about conservation, thinks a lot about extinction, I have to sort of defend myself emotionally against the reality of it. And this book, which takes place in this near future where a lot of extinctions have occurred and people are living with those consequences, I felt like it put me in touch with the true tragedy of it in ways that were difficult, but also it was kind of a relief to grapple with that in the form of fiction. Who's read The Overstory? It's a great book, isn't it? And it's part of, if you don't know, it's part of a sort of trilogy by Richard Powers that includes Bewilderment and Playground. And they're all about environmental decline and destruction in some way. They have a lot of darkness, but they also have a lot of hope and persistence in them, and they have great characters. If you live in Bend and you haven't read Sometimes a Great Notion, Run, Don't Walk, there's something to offend everyone in this book, I am sure. But it's a great read. It will forever inoculate you against Oregon stereotypes. You will never look at coastal forests the same way again. So many wildfire books I could choose. I'm going to choose Fire Weather because I think it has an appropriately epic ambition and an appropriately epic scope for what we're dealing with. I think it really gets at the enormity of our current human-amplified fire regime. If you haven't read it already, it tells the story of the 2016 mega fire in Fort McMurray, Alberta, and really dwells on the irony that, this fire that was accelerated by our use of petroleum is hitting a global hub of petroleum production. And it's very deeply reported. He spends a lot of time with the people of Fort McMurray. He doesn't traffic in stereotypes. He deals with people as individuals. It's beautifully done. Public lands. This book is a tome. Be forewarned, it's really long. I did hear an interview with John Leshy, who was solicitor of the Department of the Interior during the Clinton administration, and since then I don't think he's trained as a historian, but he's become a really wonderful historian of the public lands. This is really, for my money, it's the best thing out there if you want to really understand history of the public lands, how they came to be. And he tells this kind of counterintuitive story that they are our common ground. We always hear about conflicts over public lands, and he makes the case that they have, more than we realize, they have brought us together over time. And, we saw that this summer over the fight to sell off public lands when people from all over the political spectrum rose up against that idea. I thought that was so heartening and really a demonstration of this thesis. But as I said, this book is very long, and I heard an interview with him one time where he said, well, I was just given the advice that I could write it as long as I wanted to. I just had to make the chapters very short. And I thought, well, the chapters are short. They're just a few pages long, and it's true. It kind of makes it digestible. So don't be afraid. It has short chapters. Engineering Eden, I think this is such an interesting book. It's based on a really tragic death of a young man in the 70s from a grizzly bear attack in Yellowstone, and his family actually sued the park for negligence unsuccessfully. But that is the frame of the book, and the author uses that as a way into a really interesting discussion of what it means to manage a national park, what it means to visit a national park, what our expectations should be. Another classic, Cadillac Desert. This was a book I read when I first came to the West. I never saw the West the same way. It really surfaces the man-made infrastructure that makes the West the place it is today. Much has changed since it was written, but it's still so relevant in just exposing that structure and exposing how we have moved water around the region. And then a newer book. It's really cool, Theory of Water. It's Leanne Betasamosake Simpson is an Anishinaabe woman who lives in Canada. She's a skier. She writes really beautifully about snow, as well as writing about liquid water. And I just wrote a little essay talking about her use of the word sintering in snowpack as a metaphor for coalition building, which I just love her use of the word for what happens to a snowflake when it falls to the ground and starts to merge with its fellow snowflakes and form a snowpack that you can eventually ski on. The word for that is sintering. A couple other titles. My friend Jackie Moyer, who lives over in Corvallis, wrote this book on Gold Hill that I think is great. It's about her experience as a young farmer in California, and then her effort to grow a strain of wheat that came from her mother's home in India. And so she travels back to India to learn about the wheat. She tries to grow the wheat, and it's, eventually has to sell the farm and leave. And so it's about, all the obstacles facing small farmers today. The Unsettling of America. Any Wendell Berry fans? Yeah, he's great. Megan Kellner-Road, who I mentioned before, of Boundless Farmstead, she said, basically any writing by Wendell Berry will make a person feel called to action. He writes in such a humble and approachable way. A couple other books in this category. Anyone heard of Natural History of Empty Lots? Really cool book by a science fiction writer. It's a nonfiction memoir, but he lives on the outskirts of Austin and in a place that is sort of forgotten by planning, and he realizes what a rich place it is and what a rich diversity of people and animals and plants make it their home. He ends up building a house that sort of reflects his vision of the place. It's a very cool sort of natural history for our time. Climate Change, Ministry for the Future. Anyone read this? Yeah. Several people. So I actually found this so annoying as a novel. I had many complaints about it, but I found myself still toting it around and saying, oh God, this book is driving me crazy, but it's so important. And it's actually great because as I was reading it, I realized, oh, no one has really done this in a persuasive way. No one has really told a near future story about how we as a global society manage to turn the tide of climate change. And he tells, it's a messy story. It's a lot of people suffer and are hurt through it, but we do, in the story, global community does succeed in bending the curve of carbon dioxide, and I think it's really important what he did. And it's a really long book, and it does not have short chapters, but it's worth getting through. A couple more books on the climate change category. Warmth is a memoir by a young climate activist, and then Amitabh Ghosh, who's written really wonderfully about climate change and the limits of literature in addressing climate change. This book, it's called The Nutmeg's Curse, and it looks at climate change through a very deep historical lens, tying it back to colonialism and the outrages of the spice trade. My last category is, I'm calling it inner stewardship. How to Do Nothing. If you haven't read it, read it. It's a great handbook, I think, for anyone who thinks about the natural world, and hopefully that's all of us. It's a great memoir, long essay, handbook for reserving your precious attention for the living world from the digital world. Finally, Why Fish Don't Exist is a favorite book of mine, and I know a favorite book of a lot of people. She combines a great man biography with a murder mystery, the story of her personal struggle to find a reason to live, and a lesson on why, indeed, fish don't exist. And then I'll just mention a few other recommendations by your neighbors. I've read American Canopy. That's a great book about how trees made America. I've not read Building for People. Haven't read When Driving Is Not an Option, but found the idea fascinating. It's about the 30% of the population who can't or don't drive and understanding the challenges they face. Finally, The Wild Trees, which I almost put on my forest list because I remember when I read it years ago, but I still remember the moment when one of the scientists who's featured in the book finally gets to the top of the redwood canopy and he pokes his head out and looks around and there's dirt. There's a whole other thing going on up there, just a whole other, there's dirt and there's plants growing out of it, and it's a whole other system. Drawdown, which is highly recommended as a practical book about climate change. And then Lane Jacobson, the owner of Polina Springs Books, has already sold The Bear to half the population of Central Oregon. So this may be the half, but if you haven't read it, it sounds like a wonderful book. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your recommendations and being here tonight.